500 years ago, that's what I celebrated last Tuesday. 500 years ago to the day, October 31st, 1517, something really important happened that changed your life. It didn't change my life, Freddie. I wasn't even born then. That was when a man named Martin Luther took a paper and nailed it on a church door. More about that in time this morning. But when Martin Luther did that very act, it became known as the spark that started the Reformation, the reformation of the church. When I was at the University of Georgia, I researched this. Probably my best work that I ever did was on the Reformation. And I want to share with you some things today that most people have no idea. Most people have really no idea about how we got where we are, why the Reformation didn't go far enough, and why there are problems today in theology based on people who were Catholics who had just come out of the Middle Ages. And based on what they knew and what new things they were learning, what restoration they were trying to make in the church that had become, could I say it in a serious way, that had become a joke. But it wasn't funny to people who didn't know, who couldn't even understand how far the truth had been hidden from them since the beginning of the church. So I want to talk about this with you, the Reformation, the beginning, the roots of it, what it meant, and how it happened. If you were to do an internet search, you just type in, you can do this, Martin Luther. If you do that, you will probably get a screen full of Martin Luther, the television show. I didn't know there was one like that, but apparently there is, and now that garners all the hits. If you just put in Martin Luther, you'll get a television show. If you ask a kid, have you studied Martin Luther in school? They will likely say yes. They will probably smile at you because they've heard a lot about Martin Luther at school. And they will tell you that he was a civil rights advocate, and there are a lot of streets named after him. But they're referring to Martin Luther King, who is totally and completely separated by about 450 years from Martin Luther, who probably has no streets named for Martin Luther. Probably not one. I don't know of one. But Martin Luther, when he nailed up that paper 500 years ago last Tuesday, it changed almost everything about church as you know it, because of what he is attributed with beginning. We have come to a period in history called the Renaissance. Renaissance was a time that the Middle Ages were folding up. It was a time of discovery. They were about to break out a telescope. They were about to identify finally that the earth is not the center of the universe. Everything's not revolving around earth, but it's the sun. Copernicus and others in the discoveries that were being made a tremendous shift, a great change across Europe. And they called that the Renaissance. And you say the word now, and people say, yeah, the art, there were cool people. No, it was way more than art. It was all life-changing. Art was a part of it. They began to paint some different kind of pictures that I totally don't understand. But you might, and good for you if you like Renaissance art. But it was a time that men began to realize, hey, I can do something on my own. It's not just the crowd that I belong to. It's not in the feudal system that I was born to. I may be a peasant, but sometimes we might have some good ideas. It was sort of a personal discovery time. And then something called humanism. In fact, some say humanism started the Renaissance. But humanism was a secular idea. It says man is important. It didn't include God in man's picture. So you can understand how we're not speaking well about humanism, because that's a bad idea. To think that man is something without God, that's a bad idea. But this was a time that was encouraging to people. People got encouraged. They were being encouraged to think on their own, to discover things on their own, to have ideas that had never been thought before, and they began to reject some old ideas. And I'll pause in your understanding of the Renaissance period when all these things were becoming new, and this was a secular movement. But this secular movement had its effect on a lot of people, including people who believed in the Lord, who thought that the Bible was true, although many of them had never held one in their hands. Here's what had happened to the church. You had the church that began in Judaism. Help you accept that idea. The church didn't begin on the day of Pentecost. The roots of the church go all the way back as long as God has been saying anything in the world. The church proper started on Pentecost, the organism, church, but the idea and the framework was all laid through the pages of Scripture. How long until the truth of the gospel began to be corrupted? So you had Jesus in time who came in the fullness of the time, was born, and he had disciples. He had the 12, and then he had about 170 in a broader band of people who followed, learned, and began to do the ministry. And then when Jesus died, through the Spirit, the beginning of the church on the day of Pentecost, when the 12 began to be really involved in this organism, and they made disciples. Well, in time the disciples died too. The apostles were dead. How long do you give it? Not long at all. Not long at all until the disciples of the disciples began to get blurry about the truth. I'm telling you, leave man alone for a while and watch how he digresses. Watch how he just goes squirrely on his own. Leave man alone and watch how he runs away from the truth of God. It's really crazy what man can come up with when man is left to his own devices. But you didn't have very long at all until they began to lose their ideas that had been taught to them by the disciples. And you had guys who were being raised up who would fall for the idea that Proverbs chapter 8 is about Jesus. That there was a time that he was not. It was one of those disciples who lived shortly after the 12 disciples who came up with that idea that later would be embraced by the cults. That Jesus was created, therefore he might be a God, but he's not the God. So the cults were able to be established on some of the ideas that began to slip away from the early church. Well, give it 1,500 years and see where man takes the church. Now listen to this. Let me say something that might make you squirm a little bit, but it's only factually true, and you'll have to come to accept it, even though emotionally you may struggle with it or think that I'm mean. The church in that day is the Catholic Church, okay? The word Catholic means general. And there was one church. There's only one. The Lord made sure that there would only be one church from its very beginning. We're not going to have a Jewish church for Jewish people. We're not going to have a Gentile church for Gentile people. We're not going to have a church for slaves and a church for free people. We're not going to have a male church and a female church. One church. It's not male or female. It's not bond or free. It's not just for Jews. It's not just for Gentiles. You don't hold people out of the church because of some label that they wear. If they are a believer in Jesus, they are the church. Okay? So by the 1300s, the church had become corrupt. That's a capital C. I'm telling you, I can tell you stories that you probably would struggle to even believe how bad the church had become. Now, the word Catholic in the English won't come until later, but the church was the general church. And the word general is the word Catholic. So that's what there was in the world. And it was corrupt out its ears. Here's what it had come to. A few ideas for you. The church in its day, in its dark day, that when you were born to a certain group, you stayed in that group, Buster. And if you were a peasant farmer, it was guaranteed you'll always be a peasant farmer. Don't look into the skies. You can't discover anything there. And even if you did, no one would listen to you. And the church told people, don't read the Bible. You're not smart enough, peasant. Don't read the Bible and pretend like you can actually understand something. Are you mad yet? I'm trying to make you mad. I mean, it was forbidden that you would read the Bible. That is, assuming that you actually had one, and you didn't. As a peasant, you didn't have one. And in fact, if you did have one, you didn't. But if you'd had one, you couldn't read it. You didn't know how to read. You don't need to read to grow peas. Get out there, peasant, and grow some peas. You're not good for anything else. You're not smart enough. You don't need to go to school. You don't need to know how to read. That's only for smart people. Who are the smart people? Church people. The leaders. But in fact, if you had been able to read, you couldn't. The Bible that you had, you didn't. You wouldn't have been able to understand the language because the Bible you had wasn't in a language that you could understand. You didn't speak that language. It would have been written in Latin. There was no Bible for you, peasant. Well, how do you know anything about God? Just listen, and we'll tell you. Who said that? The priests of the church. Which maybe wouldn't have been all that bad if the priests had actually told you what the Bible actually says. But they did not. They had become so corrupt that they had corrupted the very truth that they were supposed to be telling people, and they corrupted the gospel. So the message that you heard at the church that you went to with no Bible would have sounded like this. Well, yes, Jesus died on the cross, but that was an example. And He died for some sin, but not for all, peasant. And you've been born into a bad state, and you're always going to stay in that state. And you are really a people that have no hope at all of ever connecting with God. And what you need to do is just see me as your only hope, as your priest. I hold the keys to purgatory, and I hold Uncle Bob's future in my hands. I hold your future too. You're just not dead yet, but one day you will be, and you're a terrible person, not like I am. And so really, the bottom line of it all is you need to give me money, because I'm smarter than you are. I've gone to school, you haven't. I know how to read, you don't. I have a Bible, you don't. You grow peas, I'm with God. And so the church began this corruptive teaching, and they invented ideas like purgatory. Picture the word in your mind, purgatory. It could easily be pronounced purgatory, and that'd be helpful to us because it's a purging. And what the church began to teach, never mind it's nowhere in the Bible, you don't have a Bible, peasant. And even if you had one, you couldn't read it because you're not smart enough to read, and even if you could, you couldn't read the Bible, the language that your Bible would be written in if you stole one somewhere. So there's a purgatory. Believe it. So the idea of purgatory was that you are just so bad, peasant, that whenever you die, you're not good enough to go to heaven, but maybe you got something going for you, so God will put you in a place called purgatory. And that's where God will purge you from all these bad things that God can't allow to go to heaven with you. And, well, I had the keys to the gate of purgatory. And if the price is right, I could get Uncle Bob out. And see, here's what they taught. That you don't have enough good deeds to get you into heaven. But the saints, those that were disciples and then apostles and their disciples and other people and these great people that we worship on All Hallows Eve, they had more than enough. Can you believe this? That's what you were taught. You don't have enough, you peasant, but these great saints that we adore, that we worship, they had more than enough. They had more than they need. And so we have this bank. There's this bank in heaven of good deeds that are stored up that the saints carried to heaven, but they had more than enough. And God just took those and put them in a bank. And, well, I have access to that vault. And I can get into that vault and get you some of those righteous deeds of the saints and apply them to your account. So we could just talk about how I can get into that vault and get you some of those good deeds. I can even write you a certificate that says that you hold these deeds. And there goes the teaching of indulgences. That you could actually have a banknote for heaven, not by your deeds, because you will never have enough, but we could hook you up if you'd like to talk. This is really what church had become. The idea of purgatory was invented. The idea of indulgences was invented. But how could the people know any better? So you would have been raised in a tremendous fear of hell. You couldn't read the Bible, but buddy, everybody, even children, could understand there is a burning, fiery hell, and we're going there. Unless we could get enough good deeds to make us righteous, we can't, but it's a nice hope to have until your nightmares at night remind you of a burning, fiery hell and a God who laughs to send people there. But if there was some way you could get into that vault through talking to the priest, maybe there's hope. That was a summation of the church. And as the Renaissance period began, and you had discoveries in all fields, your discoveries being made, scientists actually being emboldened to speak out against, guess who? The church. The church that had been saying, wait a minute, your model about the Son being the sinner, that's heresy. What? Heresy? And they began to have the inquests. You would be pulled in front of a board of judges. You could die for speaking out. But in the Renaissance, you had people who were emboldened to speak against what they knew was not true. And it affected some people who really were burning to know more about God. They were infected with this idea too. To learn new things, to discover more things, and make these things known. So Martin Luther lit the spark. There were really some guys who came before him who don't have enough credit. And I want to talk about two of them right now before we go into the Word together. I want to show you what set Martin Luther on a whole different course in his own personal discovery. But first, these two men ought to be mentioned. One is a guy named Wycliffe. John Wycliffe. You may have heard that name pronounced Wycliffe. But Wycliffe was in the 1300s, okay? This is in darkness. But Wycliffe was studying. And Wycliffe saw the truth and knew the truth. He knew that it was a lie in the church. That when they began to offer the Lord's Supper, now, you may or may not be good enough to even eat this cracker, peasant. But if I let you eat it, you'll know this is going to turn into the body of Jesus when you take it in your mouth. And that's called transubstantiation. It's the idea that that wafer actually becomes the body, and we're going to make a sacrifice right now. The idea is, well, you've sinned lately, and we got to pay for that sin. So Jesus is going to make a payment for you today. When you eat this cracker, you'll destroy His body, and that'll be a payment for some of your sins. So you can understand how people would rush to Mass. These people who thought all week long about the horror of going to hell, who were so desperately to eat that cracker. Well, John Wycliffe knew it was a lie. And he came out against transubstantiation. He also came out against this. The church had become so strong that the Catholics were practically the government also. And in history, you had Leo giving the emperor's crown. Well, you can't do that. But if the church was strong enough to give an emperor's crown to someone, how strong is the church? It's above the government. But the peasants didn't know, and they couldn't understand, and they were living in darkness. And so the church is taken over. And the Crusades were these marches to deliver Jerusalem. I know this is a little bit technical, but you'll understand so much. If you understand, the Crusades was the general church, the Catholic Church, trying to win Jerusalem because, well, the Jews didn't like the promises of God, so we're going to have to take over. And we'll fight for what the Jews should fight for, and we'll have to win Jerusalem, and we'll have all the promises that God gave to Israel. Well, no amount of crusades could make God change His mind about Israel. But there was one more crusade. I'll tell you about that in a moment. But these reformers began to understand, wait, God didn't put the church in charge of human government. They began to get this. If God had put the church in control of human government, why didn't Jesus take over Rome? Why did Jesus allow Himself to be put to death at the hands of the Roman government if God intended the church to be in charge of government? Wycliffe got it. Wycliffe understood that. He began to speak out. He said, hey, church, you can't control human government. That's overreach. You don't belong in that. And so the Pope thought that was a really popular idea. You know I'm joking, right? The Pope thought that's a crummy idea. And so Wycliffe was one of the first ones in history to begin to speak out about this powerful, corrupt church. When he came out against transubstantiation, he had actually written the Bible in English. Can you believe it? Because he wanted people who understood English in England to be able to understand the Bible. So he took the Vulgate, which was, it's not a good Bible, but it was the best he could do. And the Wycliffe Bible began to get into the hands of English people. You know what they did with John Wycliffe? Killed him. Who killed him? Oh yes, that corrupt governor. Yeah, governor. Oh no, church. The church. They didn't just kill him. They burned his body. They scattered his ashes in a ceremony. They paraded his death. Well, there was another one. John Huss. This is all the way back in the 1300s. Wycliffe early and Huss 1317 to 1415. That's when he lived. Listen to this. This is over 500 years ago. That has affected you. This has affected you. See, we can look at Wycliffe. We can say, he used the Vulgate and translated the Bible. It was what he had. But he put the Bible in the English language for the first time. Later, we get the benefit of the better English Bible. In 1611, the first way in the 1300s, Wycliffe, in a courageous move, used what was available to him and cobbled together an English Bible. Now, John Huss, born in 1317, he came out in his day against transubstantiation. He said that's a lie. He was against the prayer for the dead. He told people, don't pray to dead people. They don't have any power. They have no charge. Why on earth would you pray to dead people? You're supposed to pray to God. And that's elementary for us, right? But not in those days. You were born and raised in a family telling you to pray for people that you knew were in heaven because you're so bad as a peasant, but maybe you can have some connection with God through Uncle Bob because he gave some money to the church and we think he's in heaven. Pray to him. Maybe he'll get your word through to God. So he was against the prayer for dead. He came out against the indulgences, prices being paid. Came out against that, John Huss. He told people don't worship the saints. He was against priestly confession. This idea, you got to go to the priest to confess your sins. He came out against it. So that's not right. That's wrong. The Bible doesn't say to confess your sins to a priest or to give him money or to worship people in heaven. So John Huss, this hero, finally, here's what happened to Huss. The Pope called for another crusade. He wanted the church to dress up in army clothes, get their swords and spears ready, get an invasion going, and go against Naples and take that town over for the church. Could you imagine us doing that today? I heard there's some bad things going over in Winder. So this afternoon we're all going to meet. Bring your guns, everybody. We're going to take over Winder for the glory of... Could you imagine? But this was happening then. And there had been no one around to tell the church, hey, you need to back up and sit down, Skippy. You're taking on too much power. No one had ever done that. Huss did. Huss said, hey, this is not right. This is overreach. You can't just go and take over a town. Know what they did to John Huss? Killed him. They didn't just kill him. They burned him. They burned him alive at the stake. The idea is intimidation. It's intimidation. And I want to show you this man. Tyler, could you put a picture up for us? It was out of this turmoil and darkness that the Renaissance threw a light into the world, and there were people who were studying the Bible. There were people in dark corners, in dark rooms, in hidden places studying the Bible, and they were saying, just as it's true, with some of these scientific announcements, there are some things about God that were known before, but the church has hidden them. And Martin Luther then, 1517, nailed that paper on the church door at Wittenberg, Germany. Here's a picture, it'll come up in a moment, of Martin Luther. I want you to see his face. But now let me give you the background on him. He was raised in one of those homes, always hearing about hell, always hearing about how low and what a worm he was. He was scared to death of hell as a child. There were nightmares about going to hell. He lived in constant fear. He believed that heaven was for people who were righteous, had a lot of righteous deeds. He heard about the indulgences, and he tried to believe that. But he just could never be comfortable. And he was so skeptical in his mind. He was practically schizophrenic. He would think he's saved on one day, but know that he wasn't on another day. And he was terrified by going to hell in the end of it all. Well, one day, he was caught in a thunderstorm. And then this storm struck by lightning. Now imagine this. You're already having nightmares about hell, right? You're scared to death of God. You don't know anything about the love of God. You don't know grace of God. You think grace is something else, something you pay the priest for, and then he'll give you a piece of this. And it depends on other saints who you're sort of borrowing their good deeds. But he's never heard of love and grace. He's terrified of God. And you get hit with a bolt of lightning one day. Here's what he did, Martin Luther. He cried out, Saint Anne, help me! I'll become a monk. He made a deal with God. Actually, the deal was with someone named Saint Anne. Apparently someone he was worshiping, praying to, Saint Anne. St. Anne, get this word to God. Protect me now and I'll make a deal with you. I'll go to the monastery. Now the monastery was a place created by the church. This will seclude you. You're struggling with the world. You have sin. But if you'll just bury yourself in that monastery, cut all your hair off, say you'll never get married, you'll never ever think about women or any of that, you'll sort of deliver yourself from a lot of sin if you live in the monastery and serve the Lord. He's going to be a monk now. All because he was so afraid of God. There's no faith in this. There's no idea of grace. But salvation in Him is you do all the good deeds you can and hope for the best. Okay, Lord, so I don't die like this. You get me out of this storm and I'll become a monk. And so he did. So Martin Luther was in the priesthood. But Martin Luther read his Bible. He could never have any assurance about his salvation. And one day, he found Psalm 22. I want you to join me there. Psalm 22. I want you to try the best you can put yourself in Martin Luther's mindset. You're scared of God. You think God is in charge, but He's not friendly. He's mean. He wants people to go to hell. He laughs at sending people there. You're going there. You don't understand God. You never could. Somehow you could get a hold of other people's righteousnesses and add them to yours. Maybe you'll have enough, but you could never know if you made it or not. And it was then, while crying over his own lostness, he found Psalm 22. I want you to read this. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me and from the words of my roaring? Listen to this. That's exactly the way he felt. God has forsaken me. He thought that so many times growing up. He would feel close to God sometimes, but then he would know the truth that he's a sinful person, and he would felt so forsaken by God. This reigned in his mind. And he asked himself, this person feels just like I do. Forsaken by God. Look at these other words. They're underlined in my Bible. Maybe you could do that also. The word forsaken in verse 1. Then the word so far. Those are underlined. So far from helping me. And from the words of my roaring. In other words, this is a picture of someone who's just crying out to God. He's calling out to God, but feeling forsaken. Look at verse 2. I cry in the daytime. Well, that's what he'd been doing. He'd been crying all his life. It's broad daylight, but he thinks about going to hell. And he wants so much to go to heaven, but he knows that's out of bounds. I'm a sinner. And he would cry. But thou hearest not. He said, this person is like I am. He cries in the daytime, but God's not listening. Who is this person anyway? He's like I am. Whoever it is. And in the night season. And Martin Luther had cried in the night season. He talked to God so many times about being lost and going to hell and knowing he wasn't good enough. And trying to haggle with God and make deals with God. This person is like I am. Look down at verse 6. But I am a worm. That's just the way Martin Luther felt. And no man. A reproach of men. That's how I feel. And despised of the people. That's just how I feel. And as Martin Luther studied Psalm 22, he began to understand who this person is. It's really an easy study. All you have to do is look at verse 1. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Tell me, who said that? Jesus did. Where did he say it? On the cross. You can find it in Mark chapter 15, verse 34. That's Jesus. In fact, all these are quotes from Jesus. So Martin Luther understood who is talking in Psalm 22. He knew that's Jesus, and Jesus is just like me. But he knew who Jesus was. Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is God. And so he began to ask himself, he began to do this slow Bible study. Why is Jesus feeling forsaken? He shouldn't be forsaken. He's with God. I feel forsaken. I should feel forsaken because I'm a sinner. But why is Jesus crying in the daytime? He shouldn't be crying. He's God. He has heaven. I should be crying. And why is Jesus crying in the nighttime? And why does Jesus say, I roar to you, God, but I feel so far from you. I feel so forsaken. Why is Jesus saying that? Why does Jesus say, I'm a worm? I'm the worm, Martin Luther. I'm the worm, but not you, Lord. And it began to dawn on him. The only way that Jesus could say that he's a worm if he has my sin on him. And the only way that Jesus could be feeling forsaken by God is if Jesus has sin. And since he didn't have any sin, he must have my sin. And it dawned on Martin Luther, and the lights came on, that if Jesus took my sin on him, then my sin is paid. I don't need to borrow some righteousness from some dead person. I don't need to go and confess my sins from a priest and pay him money and get an indulgence written for me. If Jesus paid my sin is paid in full. And Psalm 22 opened the eyes of the monk Martin Luther. And here's what he did. He kept studying. And he ended up writing out 95 things that the church needed to discuss. The church needed to talk about. The church needed to see it's wrong. The church needed to face its corruption. And the church needed to come out and apologize and get it right. And he took this paper, he called it the 95 Theses, 95 Ideas. And he nailed it on the church door at Wittenberg, Germany. Now, that needs some explanation. The church door in that day was a lot like a bulletin board. It was a place like in your local post office that you might post an announcement. So it's not as crazy as it might seem. It's not as revolutionary like a rebel as you might think. He put a paper on the door that needed attention. Well, they had killed Wycliffe when he put his ideas out. They killed John Huss, burned him at the stake. And the word is out. You speak against the church, you better run. Get you. And so Martin Luther nailed it on the church door. Now, listen, he's no longer afraid of dying. Is that good? Is that good? What if they kill me? They may burn me in the flames of man, but I'll never go to the flames of hell because of faith in Jesus Christ, who took my sin and became a worm of this worm. 500 years ago, ladies and gentlemen, Martin Luther came out of himself and risked his life to do something for God.